Asia and the horror genre. Is there a better match on Earth? Today I'm going to talk about some of the grisliest Asian horror stories out there. A few folk tales, a couple urban legends, and some true crime scattered in there too, with stories coming from each of these countries. There's going to be a lot to unpack in this video, so here are just some of the grisliest Asian horror stories I could find. With that said, Orang Minyak is first, so we're actually hopping over to Malaysia to begin with. And the name Orang Minyak actually directly translates to oily man in Malay, and this is because the supernatural creature in question is perhaps best known for coating himself in an oily substance, and then goes around kidnapping young women at night. Now, you might be wondering why the creature coats itself in shiny black grease and oil, and this is because apparently it's learnt that this is the best way to evade capture. Now, as with many folk tales and horror stories, this one actually has a historical and social reason to exist, because back in the 1950s in Malaysia, there was a rise in rapes and sexual assault within the country, and so a lot of people, instead of facing the problem head-on, created this straw man to beat. There were rumours that it exclusively targeted virgins, and so for this reason there were a lot of superstitious female Malay students that would wear sweaty clothing intentionally to ward off the creature, as it was thought that their scent would give the impression of someone who has just been with a man. There were several movies made about the creature towards the end of the decade, and even in the decades following, each adding extra elements on top of this folktale. But the truth is that the creature has been debunked by many experts, because yes, on paper, by covering itself up with grease and oil, it would be difficult to grab a grip on the groper, but at the same time, some of the abilities that it's said to have, such as the ability to scale up walls, oiling itself up would make this more difficult. Not only that, but it would also have a difficult time grabbing women, let alone walking in the first place. It's definitely one of the more unique creatures I've ever covered though, so let's move on. People go missing all the time, right? I even have a video covering many of the most famous disappearances. And even today, with all of the technology that we have every week, many people vanish from plain sight. But this tends to be an individual, or maybe a small group, maybe even a team, but rarely a lot of people. Well, allow me to introduce you to a small Chinese battalion of 3,000 men who disappeared in 1937, allegedly never to be seen again. Now, for those of you who don't know, in 1937, Japan invaded China and committed atrocities in Nanking. This story takes place shortly prior to those atrocities occurring, and the story goes that just outside of Nanking, Chinese General Li Fuxian was anticipating an impending Japanese attack, so he stationed 2,988 men throughout a 3.2 kilometer area intent on defending the surrounding hills. The night soon passed, and as General Li Fuxian awoke, he was told some grisly news, that not a single soldier placed in his defensive line were responding to calls or signals. An investigation team was formed, and when they arrived at the troops' position, they found it completely abandoned. There was no sign of struggle, the heavy weapons were still in place, ready to be fired, but no one was there. To this very day, we still have no solid answer for what happened here, but the event caused many conspiracy theories. Some people believe that the men were abducted by UFOs. Others believe that they might have deserted the army, and many people believe that the story is not real at all. Yes, having 3,000 people mysteriously disappear is strange, but in the history of the world, stranger things have happened. What do you think happened? Do you have any conspiracy theories yourself? Let me know down in the comments. When it came to researching different Asian countries' legends and horror stories, India stood out as having very graphic stories and monsters, but the Muhnochwa stood out to me as a very interesting one indeed. To my knowledge, this story can be traced back to Kanpur in the early 2000s. Around the time, people began going missing in the area, and soon after, many people in Allahabad were found with abrasions on their face. According to them, they had survived this evil creature's attacks. What was this thing terrorizing Indians? Well, that's a question that's hard to answer. A lot of people that claim they were attacked by a monster also said that they never got a good look at it. but generally it's described as a face-eating, sharp and violent entity. Some people say that it looks kind of insect-like, but almost everyone agrees that it has large, piercing, soulless eyes. Apparently, it targets the face, attacking its victim and leading to a slow and agonizing demise. People in the local area were terrified, with the being having struck fear into the hearts of thousands since it first made an appearance. People stayed awake whole nights for months on end, afraid to go to sleep and let the Muhnochwa in. Since the early 2000s, the attacks have calmed down, and some question if the creature ever existed in the first place. But, in the words of scoopwhoop.com, where I ascertained some of this information, we may never know if the Muhnochwa actually exists, or if it was some sort of kinky Edward Scissorhands type dude. If he's out there though, well, that's good for us, cause Corona and all that. Couldn't have said it better myself. The Sweet Girl of Ancol Bridge is a folktale that takes place in Indonesia, for anyone interested, and it actually takes place within the capital of the country, Jakarta, all the way back in 1817, so over 200 years now. It's said that there was a young woman named Araya who ran away from home after a rich Chinese man came into town and demanded that she became his mistress. The man sent some thugs after Araya, who was then raped before being murdered. Her body would never be found, but legend has it that her ghost appeared to her mother shortly after her untimely death, informing her of her murder and who killed her. Now, the reason that it all ties back to Ancol Bridge is that many people ever since have sworn that near the Ancol Bridge they have seen a mysterious spectre wandering about, which many people believe might be Araya. Could it be that after she was murdered, her body was thrown over the bridge? Or could she have been murdered at the bridge and her body had since been moved to cover it up? Whatever the reason for her supposed appearance on this bridge, it's one of Indonesia's most believed tales of all time. So, the next urban legend goes by many names depending on where you're from. If you're from Malaysia, for example, you might call it the Kuntilanak. But since it's most popular in Indonesia, I'm going to call it by its Indonesian name, the Kuntilanak. And as I said, this next story is present in a few countries, Malaysia and Indonesia being two of them, but Singapore too. Now, what is this creature? Legend states that the Kuntilanak actually takes the form of a pregnant woman who is unable to give birth to a child. Alternatively, it's often otherwise described as a vampiric, vengeful female spirit. Now, if you're looking at this thing, just appearance-wise, you'll be sure to recognise it because this is yet another white lady ghost, probably the most common staple of Asian horror creatures. Long black hair, white dress, arms at its side. It's said that she lures men in before striking, and her call actually sounds like a crying baby. It's also said that she might be in the area if you can smell a dead body or the plumeria flower out of nowhere. If you happen to smell upon this flower and then shortly after see a pregnant woman nearby, get out of there whilst you still can. Our next story takes place back in 1934 in Vietnam, when a trio of buildings was first completed. It housed the family and business of Huy Bi Hua, a real estate magnate who was reputed to own about 20,000 properties in the city. Long story short, he was a very rich man. The interesting thing about these buildings though is that the main one, the one that used to be the family mansion, is apparently haunted by the ghost of Hui's daughter. The story goes that she contracted leprosy during a citywide epidemic and was confined to her bedroom on the upper floor. Back then, leprosy was viewed more as a curse than what it really is, a disease. So maybe it was a case of her family trying to protect their status and reputation, because what they did next can only be called wicked. They made an announcement that the girl had suddenly died from a mysterious illness, and they quickly arranged a public funeral to put the matter to rest. But in truth, Huy Bi Hua's daughter was actually locked away in her room. Her meals were slid through a slot at the bottom of the door. This went on for years until eventually it drove her insane, and according to legend, she took her own life. Multiple versions of this story have claimed that she hangs herself, whilst an alternate version claims that it was self-immolation, aka she burned herself alive. Since then, many people have reported seeing a ghostly figure of a woman roaming the halls of the building, and in some more extreme cases, the sound of someone crying at the dead of night. So next we're travelling via the South China Sea and the Philippine Sea to get to Japan, where our next story takes place. I think it goes without saying that Japanese folklore is absolutely shrouded with rich legends, and the Kappa is another example of that. Let me say right now that this is absolutely positively one of the weirdest legends I have ever covered. Translated in English as river child due to its small stature, this water-dwelling yokai is a human-like creature, distinctly having webbed hands and feet and a turtle-like shell on its back. Other notable features of this strange being is that apparently it has 3 anuses. Yep, 1 is not enough. 3 anuses allow it to pass 3 times as much waste as humans. But that's not where its association with the anus stops, because how do I even say this? Okay. Within Japanese folklore, there's this idea that humans have a mythical organ called the shirikodama, which translates to small anus ball. So, you know, you can guess where it's meant to be located. Apparently, Kappa know about this mythical organ and they will attack humans to extract it. There is no explanation for their reasoning behind this. Some people think that it likes to eat the shirikodama, others say that it uses it as a tax, but it's just a thing that exists in Japanese folklore. Don't ask me why, you'll have to ask a local. But that's not even all, because this single creature has so much more to it. If we're talking about how it's perceived by humans, generally the being is seen as a mischievous creature, but different tellings of Kappa stories will tell you different things about them. Their actions range from more comparatively minor misdeeds, such as looking up women's kimonos if they get too close to water, to much more evil crimes such as kidnapping, rape, murder, and disposing the murdered bodies of its victims by eating the liver and drinking the blood of its corpse until it goes dry. You know, the usual stuff. Having said that though, some people claim that if you befriend a Kappa, it can actually become a very beneficial ally. So it's important not to tar them all with the same brush, because apparently some of them can actually be benevolent. If you do come toe-to-toe with a Kappa though, there are a few different ways to defeat it, because a lot of the time it wants to fight you or something, but it's not infallible. You could diffuse the situation by bowing to it. Apparently they are obsessed with manners. You could also, if I'm not mistaken, rip its arms off. Its arms are very weak apparently, and it will serve you at your beck and call until you return its arms to them. And finally, according to this 19th century artwork by Yoshitoshi, you could fart on them. Yeah, I really don't know what kind of rancid food you had to be eating to get farts that bad so that you could defeat a mythological being, but a quick trip to Burger King and you'll be backstacked for Kappa defense for sure. The Matruculan is a Filipino urban legend, and one that I did not discuss in my Philippines urban legend video. So what is it? Well, many people believe that the Matruculan is a ghoul-type creature, and a very evil one at that. There's not a shred of goodwill in this being, because the claim for the Matruculan is that it will set target upon a young virgin woman. Later, at the dead of night, while everyone is asleep, the being will sneak into its victim's house. It will be impossible to notice it too, because it's said that the Matruculan is invisible. The creature will proceed to impregnate the virgin woman, and they will have no idea that it's happened. A short while will then soon pass, and obviously the fetus will grow unknown to its mother. And once this happens, the evil creature will return. But this time, things get worse, as legend states that this evil monster will rip open the woman's womb and eat the fetus. Some claim that it won't even stop there, seeing the fetus as merely a starter and the woman as the main course. Now, Filipino men, according to this website I found, it said that if your pregnant wife goes into labor, the only way to stop the Matruculan from coming is by waving a butterfly knife above her belly. Probably not the safest thing to do during pregnancy, but this will apparently, according to legend, ward off the invisible monster. Not that I recommend doing it. Due to it being invisible, there is no detecting it. So to all the superstitious virgin women watching this video, have fun sleeping tonight with the knowledge that it might be out there, right now, watching and waiting to strike. Maybe it already has. Moving on, we have the eerie case of Hong Kong's Hello Kitty murder. And this is perhaps one of the darkest things I've ever covered. Perhaps it's even one of the darkest things I ever will cover. This grisly murder took place back in 1999. The victim? A nightclub hostess. The story? Well, for that, we're going to have to rewind. Fan Man Yi was the name of the eventual victim, and she was abandoned by her family when young, being put into an all-girls home. When she was 15, she was told she was too old for this home, so she turned to the streets as a way to make a living, working in a brothel where she would meet her future husband, one of her clients. It was said that her husband was extremely abusive towards her though. The devastating thing about her life is that she just could not catch a break. Once they wed, she remained as a worker at the brothel, where she served many other clients. One of which was Chan Man Lok, a 34-year-old pimp, drug dealer, and more importantly, a member of the Chinese mafia. One day after using her service, Chan Man Lok realised that his wallet was missing and laid the blame on Fan Man Yi. What happened next would be completely atrocious. Man Lok, along with 2 other grown men and a 14-year-old girl called Fong, would kidnap Man Yi and take her to an apartment at 31 Granville Road. And over the next month, she would be harshly and severely tortured. The atrocities that they subjected her to are so sickening that I simply refuse to delve into the specifics. Between the 17th of March and 15th of April, her torture occurred, but eventually it was too much for her and she died while her captors were out. They then came back to see her dead, and her body proceeded to be dismembered, with her head being put into a Hello Kitty doll, hence why the name has been dubbed the Hello Kitty murder. As tragic as this was, fortunately for the sake of closure, her torturers would not get away with what they did, because that 14-year-old girl that helped to kidnap Man Yi, well, she wasn't willingly doing it. Fong was a grooming victim, and she would lead detectives to the remains of the body in exchange for immunity. She would then further testify against the men, and they were put behind bars for the barbaric acts they committed. Though, it should be mentioned that the trio were put on trial in the year 2000, and the jury could not rule that the 3 of them intended to kill the 23-year-old, and therefore they were put in prison with no review for parole for 20 years. That was 22 years ago now, so who knows? They might be on the street right now. We've had a lot of urban legends in this video so far, and we just had a true crime story. The next one though, might be up to your own discretion which category it falls into. Our next story is the Hathora group, and it takes place in Pakistan in the 1980s. Now, if you're unaware, Pakistan in the 80s, as with any country in the world, was very different. Of course, 40 years have now passed. Pakistan back in the 80s, while not crime-free, did suffer much less crime than what it sees today. But back in the years between 1985 and 1987, the capital of Karachi was introduced to a sharp spike in crime. We'll get to this in a second, but to understand the cause of this, we need to understand Pakistan in the 80s. Now, there were a ton of geopolitical events ongoing in the 80s in Pakistan, but the main one to focus on was that the Soviet-Afghan war was going on at the time, and a lot of Afghan refugees fled the country into neighbouring Pakistan, and in particular, Karachi was their destination of choice. This naturally put a strain on the city's economic resources and flared up ethnic tensions. On top of that, heroin use in the country was at an all-time high, and the combination of these factors, as well as a few others that would take much too long to explain, led to a lot of homeless people. And subsequently, police were soon alerted to a harrowing sequence of events. Throughout 1985, there were many cases seen where a homeless person or beggar was murdered via having their head smashed in with a massive hammer. First it was 1, followed by 2, 3, 4, and eventually 11 people were murdered by this method. And the police were no closer to finding out who did this. They thought a lone serial killer was on the loose, but then something would happen that busted the case wide open. As it turns out, after one person was attacked, they lived to tell the tale. And tell the tale, they most certainly would. They informed the police that it was actually a group of assailants that attacked them, at least 4. As soon as the police would find this out, the killings subsided. It wouldn't be a year, not until 1986, when the killers would resurface, before once again, more quickly this time, fading away into the shadows of Karachi. Nobody knows who was to blame. Not a single person was ever arrested for the crime. And some people still think that this so-called Hathora group is still out there somewhere. But these days though, many people even question if the group ever existed at any point. Generations later though, of course there would be an asterisk put on the group. Many people thought that the group was comprised of KGB members or perhaps Afghans intent on stoking the flames of chaos within Pakistan, but these are merely theories. Based on what I've told you, do you have any answers? Let me know in the comments. An extremely enticing story for sure. If you ask me, those absolutely were some grisly tales for my gruesome audience. If you enjoyed them, please subscribe and like the video. It would really help me out in the algorithm. Because that's all we have time for today. Patreon, Discord, Instagram, Twitter, please as usual go follow me and join and support me there. Links in the description as always. Aside from that, please let me know down in the comments what you'd like to see me do next, because I'm only 116 videos in and I'm already out of ideas. Thank you for watching.